Elite Facts presents
Another 12 facts about World War I.
12.
During the First World War, tanks were initially called land ships. The reason for this was because tanks were originally disguised as water storage tanks to give enemies a false impression that these vehicles were not weaponized. It was the British who decided to codename these vehicles tanks.
11.
It was common in both the First World War and the Second World War for soldiers of any military force to keep diary entries. French Second Lieutenant Alfred Joubert wrote in his diary about World War I just before he died that, quote, "Humanity is mad. It must be mad to do what it is doing. What a massacre, what scenes of horror and carnage. I cannot find words to translate my impressions. Hell cannot be so terrible. Men are mad."
10.
World War I was infamous for trench warfare. The trench network of World War I stretched approximately 25,000 miles from the English Channel to Switzerland. The area surrounding the trench network was known as the Western Front. British poet Siegfried Sassoon wrote, quote, "When all is done and said, the war was mainly a matter of holes and ditches."
9.
It has been recorded that after the war, millions of soldiers suffered shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder, with trench warfare playing a prominent role in their disorder. Shell-shocked men often had uncontrollable diarrhea, couldn't sleep, stopped speaking, whimpered for hours, and even twitched uncontrollably. While some soldiers recovered, others had to suffer with the disorder for the rest of their lives.
8.
During both the First World War and the Second World War, the Germans were skilled at intercepting and solving Allied codes. It was also recorded that the Germans had captured 1 out of 4 paper messengers during the Great War. However, when a U.S. commander used Choctaw tribe members from the Oklahoma National Guard unit, they used an extremely complex language that even the Germans could not translate and decipher. The 8 Choctaw men and others who joined them became known as the Choctaw Code Talkers.
7.
Even though Germany may have forced the hand of all the European powers during the summer of 1914, it didn't cause the war. Germany was not directly responsible for creating the atmosphere in which war was a possibility. The Great War began all because of a rivalry between the world's great powers, which consisted of Britain, Germany, France, Russia, Austria, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan. The 40 years leading up to the Great War were characterized by increasing nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and various alliances.
6.
Following the end of World War I, long-term effects were implemented on the world as a whole. These effects would include the formation of the League of Nations, which laid the groundwork for the United Nations, and a worldwide arms race. In addition to this, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe sanctions on Germany, which drove the country into a deep recession, setting the groundwork for World War II.
5.
It was all because of World War I that we saw the emancipation of women. When male soldiers were drafted to go to the battlefields and trenches, women would take over many traditionally male jobs, and they showed that they could perform them just as well as men could. Because of this, all women over the age of 30 were given the access to vote in the 1918 British parliamentary elections, and only 2 years later, the 19th Amendment was established in America, allowing women the right to vote. 4. Despite popular belief that Germany was the first known nation to practice chemical warfare during the First World War, it was actually France that was the first country to use gas against enemy troops in World War I. In August of 1914, France fired their very first tear gas grenades, known as xylyl bromide, against the Germans. Because of this, in January of 1915, Germany fired their very first tear gas against Russian armies, but the gas turned to liquid in the cold air. In April of 1915, the Germans were the first to use poisonous chlorine gas.
3.
In early 1917, British cryptographers deciphered a telegram from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to Germany's minister, who was based in Mexico. The telegraph encouraged Mexico to invade U.S. territory so that they could recover the lost territories of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The British decided to keep the message a secret from the U.S. for more than a month, as they wanted to show it to the U.S. at the right time in order to help draw the U.S. into the war on their side.
2.
During the First World War, there was a height limit established when enlisting in the British Army. The minimum height requirement for the British Army was 5 feet 3 inches. However, many shorter men were caught up in the recruiting enthusiasm of August 1914, and although these men couldn't join the regular military forces, the War Office reluctantly established a number of bantam battalions attached to more conventional regiments. Many of these bantams were coal miners. Because of their previous work experience, their short height and technical expertise proved to be a great asset in the tunneling work that went on underneath the Western Front. Although their skills proved useful with tunneling, bantams were not particularly effective in battle, as by the end of 1916, the general fitness and condition of men volunteering as bantams was no longer up to the standard that the British military required. It wasn't easy to maintain recruitment, as increasingly the bantam battalions had to start accepting men of average height. There's not much point in a bantam battalion that's largely made up of taller men. So after conscription was introduced in 1916, the bantam battalion's idea was quietly but swiftly dropped.
1.
During the First World War, a lot of deaths weren't directly caused by opposing enemies. Disease played a massive part in the Great War's death toll, as it accounted for a third of the war's deaths. Duck boards were eventually implemented into trenches to help ease the cases of trench foot. Trench foot was an infection caused by damp and cold, which was common due to the floors of trenches essentially being mud puddles. During the First World War, there was also a rise of semi-sanctioned brothels that were set up behind the front lines. It was recorded that around a staggering 150,000 British soldiers came down with venereal infections.
Don't forget to like us and subscribe for more elite facts.